The solicitor read the contract aloud at 9:30 in the morning, and Millicent Hargrove counted 17 clauses before he reached the one that would determine the remainder of her life. She sat very still in the chair across from the desk, her hands folded in her lap, her back not touching the cushion behind her. The morning room of Ashford Hall smelled of coal smoke and old paper, and the light through the single east-facing window was the particular pale gray of an October that had given up trying. The solicitor, a Mr. Gerald Foss, read in the even, uninflected tone of a man who had learned long ago that the words he carried had the power to ruin people, and that his only protection was to pretend they did not. Millicent listened to every syllable. She had been trained by 9 years of invisible labor to hear what mattered inside a document, and what mattered here was the clause Mr. Foss delivered last, almost as an afterthought, with his eyes on the paper rather than on her face. The Duchess of Thornvale, that would be Millicent, should she sign, would have no legal authority over the household accounts, the estate revenues, or any financial instrument pertaining to the Thornvale holdings. All decisions of a fiscal nature would remain with the Duke. Her role, as outlined in the contract's 12th paragraph, was to manage the social calendar, preside over the household staff, and appear at such public functions as the Duke required. Manage the social calendar. Millicent looked at the contract's final page. There was a line for her signature at the bottom, and above it, in dark ink, the Duke of Thornvale had already signed his name. Tristan Aldrich Cavendish, the 4th Duke of Thornvale. His hand was precise and entirely without flourish. She did not sign it yet. She asked Mr. Foss for a pen, and then she asked him for a glass of water, and in the time it took him to locate both, she read the contract again from the beginning. The season's grandest entertainment had taken place 3 weeks prior, in the ballroom of Cavendish House on Grosvenor Square, where Lord Alderley had hosted 200 guests in celebration of his daughter's engagement to a Prussian baron. Every chandelier in the building had been lit, 14 of them Millicent had counted, and the flowers alone had cost more than the annual wages of 4 housemaids. The Cavendish House ballroom was the architectural proof of what money could do when it was freed from the burden of taste. Columns painted to look like marble, mirrors positioned to multiply every candle flame until the room seemed to exist inside a star. The women wore ivory and rose and pale blue. The men wore dark coats and expressions of practiced ease. Somewhere in the middle of it all, a string quartet played compositions that cost more per note than most people in London earned in a week. And at the edge of all that luminous excess, seated at the writing desk beside the doorway to the east corridor with a household ledger open before her and a pen she had borrowed from a footman, was Millicent Hargrove. She was not a guest. She was not precisely a servant. She occupied the narrow territory between those two conditions that the social architecture of 1817 had no good name for. She was the poor relation, the unmarried cousin, the woman who had been taken in by her uncle's household 7 years ago and had repaid that charity with 7 years of unacknowledged work. Her gown was a gray-green wool that had been fashionable in 1813. Her hair was simply dressed. She wore no jewelry because she owned none. What she was doing at that writing desk, while 200 people danced and drank and performed their social obligations 20 feet away, was reconciling the quarterly accounts for the Alderley household. 3 of the entries in the wine merchant's column did not agree with the bottles actually received, a discrepancy of £11 and 4 shillings. She had identified it at 8:15. She had verified it twice since. She was now composing a note to the household steward that would resolve the matter before morning, without requiring anyone to accuse the wine merchant of fraud, which would be impolitic, or to simply absorb the loss, which would be indefensible. Millicent was 26 years old, and she had been managing crises before breakfast for the better part of a decade. She became aware of someone standing in the doorway to the east corridor at approximately 10:30. She did not look up immediately, because footmen moved through that doorway every few minutes, and she had learned to distinguish between the sound of someone passing through and the sound of someone who had stopped. This was someone who had stopped. She finished her sentence. Then she looked up. The Duke of Thornvale was taller than she had expected, though she could not have said what she had expected. She had not known he would be at this particular gathering, and she had not spent any time forming expectations about dukes. He wore a black tailcoat precisely cut, with a white cravat tied in a manner that suggested a skilled valet rather than personal vanity. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair, and the kind of face that had clearly decided some years ago to stop bothering with expression. He was looking at her, not at the ballroom, not at the door, not at the corridor behind him, at her. She looked back at him with the particular steadiness of someone who has nothing to prove and no energy to waste on social performance. He did not compliment her. He did not smile. He said, with the precise economy of a man who had decided the question was worth asking, "Is that the Alderley wine account?" "The third quarter wine account," Millicent said. "Yes." He looked at the ledger on the desk, not at her, but at the ledger. And the discrepancy? She had not told anyone about the discrepancy. She considered him for a moment, the angle of his attention, the absence of any performance in his posture, and then she said, £11, 4 shillings. The merchant invoiced for 14 cases of the Burgundy. 13 were received. He was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he said, "My estate steward has the same problem with the same merchant." He paused. Different house, same pattern. It was not a compliment. It was a piece of operational information, offered as such. Millicent noted it and filed it in the part of her mind where useful facts were stored. "I'll include the delivery manifests in my note to Mr. Alderley's steward," she said. The Duke nodded, once, and stepped back into the corridor. She did not know then that he had already asked Lord Alderley who she was. She did not know that he had stood in that doorway for 11 minutes before she looked up, watching her work. She returned to her ledger. The ballroom continued behind her, full of chandelier light and calculated smiles. She pressed her pen to the page and wrote the remaining 3 lines of her note, and did not think again about the Duke of Thornvale until 3 weeks later, when Mr. Gerald Foss arrived at her uncle's house with a contract and a proposal. Her father had died in the winter of 1808, which was both a grief and a practical catastrophe, as those two conditions are rarely as separate as the living prefer to believe. Millicent had been 17. Her father, Edmund Hargrove, had been a man of moderate means and immoderate kindness, a solicitor himself as it happened, which gave her later life a quality of painful irony she did not permit herself to dwell on. And when he died of a fever in January, it became apparent within a fortnight that the means had been somewhat more moderate than anyone had understood. There was the house in Dorset, which had a mortgage. There was the practice, which had 3 clients and an assistant who immediately sought employment elsewhere. There was a small savings account that covered the funeral and not a great deal more. There was Millicent, who was 17 and had no living relatives, except for her father's elder brother, Lord Bertram Alderley, who had married well and lived in London, and who had, over the preceding 17 years, sent a Christmas card and occasional evidence that he remembered Edmund Hargrove existed. Lord Alderley came to Dorset in February to settle the estate, which took 4 days. On the 5th day he informed Millicent that she would come to London and live under his roof, as there was no other sensible arrangement. He said this in the tone of a man doing something virtuous and slightly inconvenient. Millicent thanked him precisely and began packing. She arrived in London in March 1808 with 1 trunk, her father's practice ledgers, which she had taken because they were the thing most like a record of who he had been, and a facility with accounts that she had developed by doing her father's bookkeeping from the age of 13. He had taught her himself, without ceremony, because he had needed the help and she had been willing and quick. She had not understood until much later that this was unusual. She had simply thought it was work, and she had liked doing it well. The Alderley household was large, well-staffed, and completely without intellectual occupation for a young woman of 17, with a working knowledge of double-entry bookkeeping and a temperament suited to solving problems. Her uncle was not unkind. Her aunt, Lady Alderley, was not unkind either. She was simply occupied with the 3 daughters who needed to be launched, the 2 sons who needed to be educated, and the social calendar of a household with genuine standing in London society. Millicent was not unkind either. She was simply available. It began with the household accounts, which she offered to review after she noticed a recurring error in the monthly tallies. An innocent error, a matter of the under-butler copying figures from 2 different columns into a single row. She corrected it, showed the correction to her uncle, and said nothing further. Within a month, the steward had begun bringing the accounts to her directly. Within 6 months, she was effectively managing the household budget for a family of 9, with an annual expenditure of £4,000, and her uncle had stopped thinking about the accounts entirely because they were never wrong. She did not resent this. She was honest with herself about that, in the way she was honest about most things. She was good at this work, and being good at something difficult has its own satisfaction, even when no one is watching. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing, and Millicent kept the room standing without requiring anyone to acknowledge that she had. What she did resent occasionally, quietly, in the private territory of a mind she kept to herself, was the specific texture of invisibility. Not being overlooked at dinners, she was used to that. Not being excluded from social calls, she was useful enough elsewhere. What she resented was the moment when her uncle, in conversation with a visitor, described the remarkable efficiency of his household management and gave credit, in genuine rather than strategic ignorance, to the steward she had trained and the systems she had built. She would not have needed praise. She would have needed only accuracy. She straightened her spine on those occasions and returned to her list. By the time she was 19, she had renegotiated the household's arrangement with 3 creditors: the baker, the coal merchant, and the linen supplier, reducing the annual cost by £63 by moving to quarterly settlement at a small discount. She had done this by sitting down with each merchant, reviewing the payment history she kept in her own ledger, and making a case that was so clearly organized and so obviously correct that the merchants agreed, not because they felt they had been managed, but because the logic was simply sound. She told her uncle the figure had been achieved through routine renegotiation. He nodded and moved on to the next topic. By the time she was 22, she had begun receiving quiet inquiries from other households whose stewards had heard of her work. Not formal inquiries, nothing that would have required acknowledgement or compensation, just questions, passed through servants' networks, asking how the Alderley household kept its wool merchants' invoices so clean, or what method they used for the quarterly reconciliation. She answered those questions in writing, carefully and completely, and she filed copies of her answers in a box under her bed, because she had learned from her father that the only record you can rely on is the one you made yourself. She had one letter in that box that was different from the others. It was from her father, written in the last autumn before his death, in the deliberate hand of a man who was already tired. He had written, "You see patterns where other people see confusion, Millicent. That is a gift your world will not know what to do with. You will have to decide what to do with it yourself." She had read that letter perhaps 200 times. It had become less painful and more instructive with each reading, which was, she thought, exactly what he would have wanted. She was not going to step aside for anyone. And so, at 26, when the unmarried daughter of a viscount arrived at a ball wearing a gown Millicent had quietly arranged, because Lady Alderley had asked her to manage the dressmaker, and Millicent had managed the dressmaker, and the dress had been correct. Millicent sat at a writing desk and reconciled the wine account and was seen, without her knowledge, by a duke who had come looking for something specific and had not expected to find it there. Tristan Aldrich Cavendish had been the fourth Duke of Thornvale for 6 years, and in those 6 years he had learned to manage the title the way an engineer manages a structure with a known weakness, systematically, without sentiment, and with constant attention to the points most likely to fail. The known weakness was money, not the catastrophic absence of it. The Thornvale estate was not ruined. It was something more insidious. The estate was producing less than it should, by a margin wide enough to matter and narrow enough to be persistently ignored. His father, the third Duke, had managed the estate with the cheerful inattention of a man who considered practical concerns beneath his attention, and had died in 1811, leaving behind a household that functioned in the way that badly maintained bridges function, apparently sound, until the load increased. Tristan had inherited the bridge. He had also inherited a mother who was not there to help him understand it. The Duchess had died when Tristan was 12, in the year that he had gone to school, and she had gone to the Thornvale estate in the Yorkshire uplands to recover from a winter illness. She had not recovered. He had received a letter at school, written by the estate steward in the obligatory formal cadences of a man conveying bad news to a child. He had read it twice, folded it, and placed it in his coat pocket, and had not mentioned it to anyone for 3 days, which was not coldness but the particular shock of a boy who has not yet learned that feelings can be expressed in any form other than control. He had kept the letter for 23 years. It was still in the first drawer of his desk at Thornvale. He did not perform sentiment. He performed competence, because competence was the only tribute he knew how to pay to a woman who had managed his father's household, his childhood, and her own considerable intelligence with the same quiet efficiency that he now recognized when he encountered it in others, with an almost involuntary attention. He had begun looking for a wife in the spring of 1817, which was the polite term for what was actually a practical assessment of a structural problem. Thornvale needed, in addition to its revenue issues, an heir. It needed a duchess capable of managing a household of 32 staff, 3 tenant farms, a social calendar with 37 annual obligations, and a duke who communicated primarily through action and had been told, on multiple occasions, that he was difficult. He had engaged the services of a private inquiry agent in April to produce profiles of suitable candidates, not unusual though rarely admitted, and he had read through 14 profiles before concluding that what he was looking for was not listed in any of them. What the profiles described were credentials: family name, fortune, social connections, appearance. What they could not describe was the quality of mind he was looking for, because that quality did not appear in genealogy tables or voucher documents. He needed someone who could actually run something, someone who had been doing real work. The inquiry agent's 15th report had been different. It had arrived in August, addressed to the matter of one Miss Millicent Hargrove, currently residing in the household of Lord Bertram Alderley, described as the Lord's niece and household assistant. The report was 12 pages. The inquiry agent, a Mr. Oswald Fitch, whom Tristan had employed before and found reliable, had written in his typically spare style, "Miss Hargrove manages the Alderley household accounts with a degree of precision that the regular staff are unable to account for by any method other than attributing the work to the steward." The steward, when questioned indirectly, made clear that he consults Miss Hargrove on all matters of significance. She appears to receive no compensation beyond her lodging and board. She has held this arrangement for 7 years. She is unmarried. She is not considered a matrimonial prospect by the Alderley family or their social circle. She is not considered by the Alderley family or their social circle at all. Tristan had read that last sentence twice. He had attended the Alderley entertainment in October on a secondary pretext. He had business with Lord Alderley regarding a tenant dispute, and he had asked, before entering the ballroom, where Miss Hargrove typically stationed herself during the household's social events. A footman had directed him to the writing desk, beside the east corridor door. He had stood in that doorway for 11 minutes, watching her work. She had not looked up for 11 minutes, not from social anxiety. He had seen social anxiety, knew its hallmarks. She had not looked up because she was finishing a thought, and she did not stop mid-thought for anything that had not yet established its importance. He had asked about the wine account because it was the quickest way to establish whether she was as operationally fluent as the report suggested, or whether the report had been generous. She was not as operationally fluent as the report suggested. She was more so. He attended the Alderley dinner 2 weeks later, having arranged the invitation through Lord Alderley's social secretary on the pretext of the ongoing tenant business. He arrived at 7 and was seated, by arrangement he had not made himself but had not discouraged, at a table where Millicent Hargrove was not seated. He spent the better part of the fish course watching her manage the seating difficulty that arose when Lady Alderley's cousin arrived 20 minutes late and there was no chair, a difficulty that Millicent resolved within 4 minutes by quiet instruction to a footman. A chair appeared from somewhere. A place was set with efficiency and without any visible disruption to the table's arrangement, and no one who had not been watching carefully would have known there had been a problem. He had not been watching anyone else all evening. He authorized Mr. Foss to approach Lord Alderley with the proposal on the 23rd of October. He wrote the contract himself, which was irregular, and asked Mr. Foss to review it for legal accuracy. The original draft had contained 23 clauses. He removed 6 of them in the second revision, including the one that would have restricted her contact with the household staff to formal channels only. He left the clause about the accounts. He was aware, even as he left it, that it was a test he was setting for himself as much as for her. He wanted to see if she would sign it as written, or if she would do what he suspected she would do. He signed his name at the bottom of the page and sent the contract to Mr. Foss, and did not sleep well the following 2 nights, which he attributed to the cold coming through the window of his London house, and did not examine further. Millicent read the contract 3 times, drank her glass of water, and then sat for a moment with her hands still in her lap and looked at Mr. Foss. "There is a clause," she said, "that concerns the fiscal authority of the household." "Clause 12, Mr. Foss confirmed. "The Duke's standard provision. The Thornvale estate runs 37 annual social obligations," Millicent said. "I understand this because the Duke's inquiry agent, Mr. Fitch, was thorough, and Lord Alderley's steward was not difficult to speak with." She watched Mr. Foss absorb this without expression. "Those 37 obligations require a household budget managed on a quarterly basis. The social calendar cannot be run without account authority. Clause 12, as written, makes it impossible to do the work that Clause 11 requires." Mr. Foss looked at her, then he looked at Clause 12, and then Clause 11, and then back at Clause 12. He was quiet for approximately 10 seconds. "I will convey your concern to the Duke," he said. "I would prefer," Millicent said, "to convey it myself." She met Tristan Cavendish for the second time in the library of his London house on the 4th of November, 1817. He was standing when she arrived, which she noted. Most men received women seated. He was at the window, looking out at the street, and he turned when she entered with the unhurried movement of someone who does not perform surprise. She sat in the chair he indicated. He remained standing for a moment, and then sat across from her, which was more punctuation than courtesy. He had decided to be at the same level. She filed that. "The clause," he said. "Clause 12 is incompatible with Clause 11, she said. She had brought the contract. She had annotated it in pencil, not ink, which would have been presumptuous, with precise marginal notations at each point of conflict. She placed it on the table between them and turned it so he could read her annotations without craning his neck. He looked at the annotated contract for perhaps 40 seconds, reading everything she had written. It did not change, but she had spent 9 years learning to read stillness, and what she read in his was not displeasure. "If you have account authority," he said, "what constraint does the contract provide?" "The constraint is the ledger itself," she said. "Every expenditure recorded, every decision documented, every quarter reconciled and available for your review. I do not need the accounts unmonitored. I need the authority to make decisions without waiting 3 days for your approval on each flower order." He looked at her for a moment. It was the same measuring attention he had offered in the doorway at the Alderley ball, but they were much closer now, and there was no crowd noise to absorb the quality of it. She did not look away. "I'll have Foss redraft Clause 12, he said. "I've already written the replacement language," Millicent said. She had. It was on the back of the contract's last page, in pencil, 6 lines that gave her full account authority for household expenditure under £15 per item, requiring his review and signature for any single expenditure above that threshold, with a quarterly reporting obligation she would fulfill in writing. It was, she was aware, a better clause than the original. He read it. He read it a second time. "You wrote this last night," he said. "This morning," she said, "at 4. He did not say anything. He simply picked up the pen from the table beside him, crossed out the original Clause 12, and wrote, "See amended language, reverse page," in its place, then initialed the change. He turned to the back page. He read her 6 lines once more, and then he signed beneath them. She signed below his signature. He looked at the signed page. "This is a transaction," he said, "not a marriage. I want you to understand that clearly. The estate requires what you can provide. The arrangement is practical. I am not offering nor requesting anything beyond the terms we've just signed." "I understood the contract," Millicent said. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like kindness. The Duke's estate lay 60 miles north of London in Derbyshire, which Millicent reached by carriage in the first week of December, which was the week after the ceremony. A brief, correct affair at a London church, attended by Lord Alderley, who was gratified, Lady Alderley, who was bewildered, and Mr. Foss, who served as the necessary second witness and was professional throughout. Tristan had stood at the altar with the bearing of a man completing a legal instrument. Millicent had stood beside him with the bearing of a woman who had made a considered decision and intended to act on it. She had, in fact, spent 4 days between the signing and the ceremony examining the decision from every angle she could reach. She had pulled out her father's letter and read it twice. She had sat with the annotated contract and traced the replacement Clause 12 with her finger. She had thought about Clause 12 for a long time, because Clause 12 was not just about flower orders. It was about the specific texture of a mind that would leave an incompatible clause in a contract and then sit still while she identified it, as though the identification itself were the answer he had been waiting for. She did not know if she trusted him. She thought she might learn to. Thornvale House was larger than she had anticipated and in better condition than she had feared, though the condition of the accounts, which she asked to see on her second morning, was the reverse. Not worse than she had feared, but more interesting. She sat with the estate steward, a Mr. Cartwright, a man of 50 with the expression of someone who had been managing an under-resourced situation for years and had made his peace with it, and she spent 6 hours with the quarterly ledgers. There were 3 tenant farms. The northernmost farm was producing below its rated capacity by approximately 20%, which the ledger attributed to soil variation. Millicent read the notation and wrote beside it, "Verify with yield records for same field, 1810-1814. The yield records, when Cartwright produced them, showed no soil variation. The yield drop had begun in 1815 and corresponded exactly with the departure of the previous head tenant and the arrival of his replacement. She made a note. The household accounts themselves were in reasonable order, better than the Alderley accounts had been when she arrived, which she considered encouraging. The category she flagged first was the coal merchant, where the quarterly invoice had increased by £14 over 18 months without any corresponding increase in consumption. She asked Cartwright for the delivery records. He produced them. The increase was in the rate per ton, which had been raised twice, each time by a note from the merchant rather than a renegotiated agreement. She wrote down the merchant's name and the figures and closed that ledger. She was on her fourth ledger when the library door opened and Tristan came in. He had been at the far end of the estate since her arrival. "Tenant matters," Cartwright had said, with the particular tone of someone who was used to the Duke disappearing into operational concerns. He stopped when he saw her. She was surrounded by ledgers, which she had arranged on the large library table in a specific order she had developed over years. "You found the library," he said. "The housekeeper showed me," Millicent said. She did not look up immediately. She was finishing a row of figures. Then she looked up. His cravat was crooked, not dramatically, but visibly, tilted perhaps 15 degrees to the left. She had noticed it when he entered. "Your cravat has been crooked since you came through the door. I suspect it has been crooked since at least this morning." He looked at her. Then, without any particular expression, he reached up and straightened it, and was silent for a moment. "How long have you been here?" 6 hours, she said. "Your coal merchant has been raising his rate without a formal renegotiation, £14 over the last year and a half." She turned to the relevant ledger and showed him the column. "I would like to meet with him before the next quarterly invoice." Tristan sat down across the table from her, not to see the ledger. He angled his chair slightly so they were both looking at the same page. "Cartwright has mentioned it." "Cartwright mentioned it in a note to the ledger," Millicent said. "He did not act on it." She paused. "I will." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What else have you found?" She told him about the North Farm yield drop and the coal merchant and the wool merchant's invoice discrepancy. A smaller one, £6, but consistent across 3 quarters, and the social calendar items that had been double-booked for February, which would require either a cancellation or a creative reorganization she had already begun planning. She spoke with the economy of a woman accustomed to being listened to by people who needed information delivered usefully. He listened without interrupting. She had, in 9 years, been interrupted on average 4 times per conversation by men who thought they understood what she was going to say before she finished saying it. He did not interrupt once. When she finished, he said, "The North Farm. The previous head tenant left under what circumstances?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I'll find out." He nodded. It was the nod of a man who had just decided something, though she could not yet read what. Thornvale's social season began, insofar as a winter estate could be said to have one, with a dinner in the second week of December that Tristan had scheduled before Millicent's arrival and had apparently been faintly dreading for reasons Cartwright referred to as the usual December complications. Millicent asked Cartwright what the usual complications were. Cartwright told her, in the careful tone of a man choosing his words. The Duke had been expected in most quarters to arrive at this dinner with a different wife, or rather, the guests had expected a different name. Most specifically, Lady Charlotte Westmore had expected a different name. Lady Charlotte Westmore was 23, the daughter of Viscount Westmore, and she arrived at the Thornvale December dinner in a gown of pale gold silk that had clearly been designed for a woman who expected to be the center of attention in this room. She was beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful when they have grown up understanding that beauty is a form of currency and have invested in it accordingly. She came with her mother, and she came with the particular composure of someone who has not yet accepted that a thing she expected has failed to materialize. Millicent wore dark green wool, which was the best dress she owned, and stood in the receiving line beside Tristan because that was where the Duchess stood. She was the first woman in Thornvale in 6 years. The room was aware of this in the way rooms are aware of structural shifts. Not all at once, but in spreading, recalibrating ripples. Lady Charlotte greeted Millicent with perfect courtesy and eyes that made a comprehensive assessment in under 3 seconds. "You must be finding Thornvale quite overwhelming," she said, with the particular smile that requires no warmth. "After London." "I find it very well organized," Millicent said, "though I'm identifying a few areas for improvement." Lady Charlotte waited, perhaps, for uncertainty. She did not find it. The dinner itself was managed without incident, largely because Millicent had gone over the seating plan 3 times the previous day and had made 4 specific adjustments that distributed the conversational load across the table in a way that prevented the 2 guests with competing business interests from being seated in direct eye line of each other. She had told Cartwright why she was making each change. She had not told Lady Alderley's equivalent here, a Mrs. Partridge, the Thornvale housekeeper, who had worked in the house for 22 years and was assessing Millicent with the careful patience of someone who has learned not to form immediate opinions. But she made sure Mrs. Partridge could see the adjusted plan and its result. After dinner, the gentlemen lingered over port, which Millicent used to review the kitchen accounts with Cook, a large, competent woman named Mrs. Bell, who had, within 48 hours of Millicent's arrival, decided that the new Duchess was not what she had anticipated, and was willing to be cautiously approving. Mrs. Bell showed her the December food costs. Millicent found 2 redundancies and suggested a change to the morning bread order that would save 8 shillings a month. Mrs. Bell wrote it down without being asked, which was, in Millicent's experience, the highest form of practical endorsement. The evening's difficulty arrived not at dinner but afterward, in the drawing room, when Lady Westmore, the mother, positioned herself beside Millicent with the smooth inevitability of someone executing a prepared maneuver. "We had rather hoped," Lady Westmore said, with a warmth that did not reach her eyes, "to see Charlotte in this house in a rather different capacity. I hope you understand that our interest in Thornvale's affairs is of a long-standing nature. Charlotte has been intimate with this house since childhood." "I understand the expectation," Millicent said. "Then you understand that Thornvale requires a certain management, a certain established position in society, a name that carries weight in these circles." She paused. "Charlotte's father is a viscount, of course. Charlotte herself has been managing her family's social affairs since she was 17. "As have I," Millicent said, "for a different family, and without credit, but the work was the same." She met Lady Westmore's gaze without rancor and without apology. "I have the account ledgers, the social calendar, and the correspondence files that document 9 years of that work. They are available should anyone require verification." Lady Westmore was very still for a moment. Then she inclined her head slightly and moved away. Tristan was across the room. Millicent did not know if he had heard. His face gave nothing. The friend arrived 3 days after the dinner, in the form of an unexpected caller, Miss Harriet Blaine, 28, the daughter of a neighboring estate owner, who arrived without announcement on a Tuesday afternoon and was shown into the morning room, where Millicent was reviewing the tenant farm records she had requested from the county registry. "I heard there was finally a real person in this house," Harriet Blaine said by way of introduction. She sat down without waiting to be invited and looked at the spread of papers on the table. "Are those the county yield records? Cartwright has been trying to get those for 2 years. 3 weeks, Millicent said. "I asked for them 3 weeks ago." Harriet Blaine looked at her with frank and immediate approval. "Right," she said. "Good." Harriet became, within a fortnight, the thing Millicent had not known she was missing: a witness, not a defender, not an instructor, simply a person who saw her clearly and made no effort to reframe what she saw. She was direct in a way that had clearly alarmed more careful people, and would have alarmed Millicent if she had had any energy left for alarm. She was indignant on Millicent's behalf on several specific occasions, and restrained herself from acting on that indignation, primarily because Millicent asked her to. The elder mentor arrived in the person of Sir Edward Lyme, a retired estate advisor who had served the Thornvale estate under Tristan's father, and who visited the estate in late December, ostensibly to deliver a set of historical estate maps that had been stored at his house in Derby. He was 73, walked with a stick, and had eyes that missed very little. He found Millicent in the estate office, which had been cleared of 7 years of accumulated correspondence and reorganized, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before she looked up. "Your father's solicitor trained you," he said. It was not a question. "My father trained me," she said. "He was the solicitor." Sir Edward looked at the reorganized room. "The previous Duchess had this room laid out completely differently," he said. "She was the last person who managed this estate properly." He paused. "I'll send you her correspondence files. She kept carbons." Millicent looked at him. "Thank you," she said. It was the most complete sentence available. The matter of the North Farm was resolved in the 3rd week of December, when Millicent finished tracing the yield records and found, in the county registry documents, evidence that the current head tenant, a Mr. Horace Blenn, had been routing a portion of the farm's produce through a separate sales arrangement that bypassed the estate's records entirely. It was not dramatic fraud. It was the kind of patient, incremental diversion that requires years and a record keeper who does not look too closely. She estimated the loss to the estate over 3 years at approximately £240. She brought the records to Tristan in the library on a Thursday evening. He was reading, the first time she had seen him doing anything other than managing estate business, and he set the book down when she came in. She spread the records on the table beside him. She had prepared a single sheet summarizing the pattern, with the relevant figures and the corresponding registry entries marked with small penciled arrows. She did not explain the summary because the summary was self-explanatory. She simply placed it in front of him and waited. He read it. He turned to the registry documents and verified 2 of the entries she had marked. He was quiet for perhaps 2 minutes. "How long did this take you?" he said. "The identification took 4 days, she said. "The verification took 3. £240, he said. "Over 3 years. The annual loss is approximately £80. She paused. "The North Farm's rated capacity, at current wool prices, is 620 annually. Without the diversion, and with a head tenant who isn't running a separate arrangement, I estimate we recover that full figure plus the 400 additional that better pasture management would produce." He looked at her. "You've planned the pasture management." "Provisionally," she said. "I'd want Cartwright's input on the specifics." She hesitated for a moment, not from uncertainty but from the question of what to say next. "This is the estate's primary revenue problem, isn't it? The systemic undercounting across all 3 farms. Not just Blenn." He was still. She had named something he had known without being able to locate its source, and she watched that recognition move across his face the way weather moves across open ground. Briefly, completely, gone. "Yes," he said. She had brought everything she had, and she put it to work. They stayed in the library that evening for 3 hours. She walked him through the revenue picture she had assembled across all 3 farms and the household accounts, and he added what she did not have: the background on the tenant arrangements, the specific conversations with Cartwright, the inheritance-era context that the ledgers alone could not provide. It was the first time they had worked side by side, and it felt to Millicent like the particular rightness of a structure that has been given the correct load-bearing support at last. At some point past 10 o'clock, she realized she was cold, and that the fire had burned low, and that she had not noticed either thing because she had been working. She pressed one hand briefly against the wall beside the fireplace to warm it. Tristan, without a word, rose and built up the fire, and then crossed the room to the coat rack beside the library door, took his own coat from it, and brought it back and placed it over her shoulders. She went very still for a moment. It was not surprise exactly. It was the particular stillness of a woman who has not been looked after in a very long time and does not quite know where to put the feeling. "Thank you," she said, and returned to the ledger. He did not say anything. He simply sat back down and continued. She had also, without entirely intending to, begun playing the piano in the evenings. There was a pianoforte in the music room, a fine instrument that had clearly not been regularly played in some years. Mrs. Partridge told her, on a Monday morning over the household scheduling, that the previous Duchess had played every evening. Millicent thanked her for the information and did not comment on the obvious implication, which was that the room had been essentially closed since then. She began playing primarily because she needed somewhere to put the parts of the day that could not be expressed in ledger entries. She played after dinner, when the house had quieted, for perhaps 40 minutes at a time. She played from memory. She had learned from a teacher in Dorset when she was 12, and had maintained the habit through the Alderley years on the Alderley household's instrument, which she had been permitted to use on Sunday evenings. She discovered in the third week of December that Tristan stood outside the music room when she played. She discovered this because Mrs. Partridge mentioned it, with the careful neutrality of someone conveying information without interpretation. "His Grace has been standing in the corridor, Your Grace, in the evenings, and then, every evening this week. She had not invited him in, and he had not entered. She had continued to play. On the 23rd of December, she chose, deliberately, to play a composition she had found in the music room's folio cabinet, a handwritten piece, unsigned, in a feminine hand, that she had identified as probably dating from the early years of the century. Sir Edward Lyme, when she had described it to him during his visit, had said, without visible emotion, that would be the third Duchess. She composed her own pieces. 3 or 4 of them, I think. The Duke, the current Duke's father, never had them played after she died. Millicent had practiced the piece for 2 days before she played it properly. On the 23rd, she played it through from beginning to end, and when she finished, she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, and then she said, clearly enough to carry through the door, "You may come in, if you like." There was a pause of perhaps 10 seconds. He came in. He stood in the doorway of the music room with the same contained stillness she had learned to read over the past 3 weeks, and she turned on the bench to look at him, and his face was not quite still in the way it usually was. "That was hers," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. She did not fill the silence with anything unnecessary. "She played every evening," he said, "when I was home from school." "I know," Millicent said. He crossed the room then, not toward her but toward the window, and stood with his back to the room for a moment. She waited. She was good at waiting when the waiting was necessary. "You named it before I did," he said finally. It was not entirely about the music. They both understood that. "You knew what it was," she said. "You simply hadn't said it yet." It was not a transaction, and he had forgotten the terms somewhere around the 4th ledger and the 2nd evening in the library, but he did not say so yet. The formal challenge arrived in January, carried into the drawing room by 3 people simultaneously: Lord Aldrich Cavendish, Tristan's father's younger brother, who had expected the dukedom to pass to a different branch after the 3rd Duke's death, and had been structurally inconvenienced when it had not, and 2 estate creditors who had arrived together, which Millicent clocked as coordination before anyone had said a word. Lord Aldrich Cavendish was 61, silver-haired, and possessed of the particular authority of a man who had spent his life believing that the right blood automatically conferred the right judgment. He had not been at the December dinner. He had, apparently, been gathering information. He arrived with the two creditors, a Mr. Winslow, wool merchant, and a Mr. Dunbar, a London investor with a share in the Thornvale North Farms revenue arrangement, and he sat down in the Thornvale drawing room as though he had been a long time away from a chair he considered his own. "I'll speak plainly," Lord Aldrich said. He did not include Millicent in the address, which was the first mistake. "This marriage is irregular. The estate cannot afford an irregular arrangement at the current juncture. The investors are concerned." Tristan was at the other end of the room, standing. Millicent was seated, because she had been seated when they arrived and she had no intention of adjusting her position to perform either deference or alarm. "The estate's finances are improving," Tristan said. "The North Farm has been a problem for 3 years," Mr. Dunbar said. He was the investor, and he had the focused urgency of a man protecting a position he had already privately decided was threatened. "The yield drop is unexplained. The creditors have not been receiving the assurance they require," Millicent said. "The yield drop on the North Farm is fully explained. It is documented." They both looked at her. Lord Aldrich's look had the quality of a man who had not expected the furniture to speak. "I have the county yield records, the estate ledgers from 2015 through 2017, and the documentation of the separate revenue arrangement that Mr. Horace Blenn has been running from the North Farm at the estate's expense." She said this in the same even tone she used for explaining a quarterly reconciliation. She had the documents with her, because she had known, 3 days ago, that this meeting was probable. Harriet Blaine had told her Lord Aldrich was in the county. Sir Edward Lyme had told her about the investor relationship. She had prepared accordingly. "The annual loss to the estate from Mr. Blenn's arrangement has been approximately £80. The total over 3 years is £240. The documentation includes the registry cross-references." She placed the prepared folio on the table in front of Mr. Dunbar. He looked at it, he opened it, he was quiet. "Furthermore," she said, turning to the wool merchant, "the rate increases applied to the Thornvale account over the last 18 months, £14 above the prior agreed rate, were applied without a renegotiated contract. I have the original contract," she produced it from the folio, "and the invoices." She placed them beside it. "The overage is recoverable." Mr. Winslow looked at the invoices. His jaw was very slightly less certain than it had been when he entered. Lord Aldrich was still looking at her with the expression of a man recalibrating at speed. "This is not the point of the discussion," he said. "The point is the marriage's suitability and the estate's stability under current management." "The estate's stability under current management," Millicent said, "is improving. Specifically," she turned to the next page of the folio, "the household expenditures are down 11% from the previous quarter. The North Farm revenue will be fully recovered in the spring season once the tenancy is reorganized. The coal merchant account is in renegotiation. The social calendar for 1818 is complete, and the 37 annual obligations are confirmed with no double bookings." She closed the folio. "I am the current management. These are my results over 6 weeks." The room was very still. Lord Aldrich looked at Tristan. Tristan was looking at Millicent. She had not argued. She had not pleaded or explained herself in personal terms or made any appeal to emotion or sympathy. She had presented. The ledger was the weapon, and she had brought it loaded. The investor, Mr. Dunbar, cleared his throat. "The Blenn arrangement," he said, looking at the documentation. "Was he aware you had identified it?" "He will be by Friday," Millicent said. "I have an appointment with the county magistrate on Thursday to file the relevant records. Mr. Blenn has been given the opportunity to repay the diverted amount voluntarily. He has until Wednesday." Mr. Dunbar looked at Mr. Winslow. Something passed between them that was not quite chagrin and not quite respect, but was somewhere between the two, on the side that mattered. The public reckoning came not in the drawing room but at the quarterly investor meeting in Derby in the third week of February, which Tristan had attended every year since inheriting, and which had, in previous years, been exercises in politely managed anxiety. This year Millicent accompanied him, which was not routine and was acknowledged as such by the 9 investors around the long mahogany table before anyone had said a word. Lord Aldrich Cavendish was there, which she had expected. Lady Charlotte Westmore's father, Viscount Westmore, was there as a minor investor, which she had not expected but noted. Mr. Dunbar was there, subdued since January. Mr. Winslow was not present, which meant the coal merchant renegotiation had resolved satisfactorily. It had, by £14 annually in recovered margin, and she had confirmed it in writing the previous week. The meeting opened with the estate's previous year financial summary, delivered by the estate's Derby solicitor in the even tones of a man reading numbers he found inadequately encouraging. When he finished, Millicent asked if she might present the current quarter's figures. There was a pause around the table. Tristan said, "She manages the estate accounts," in a tone that closed the question. She stood. She had brought 2 copies of the prepared summary, one for the table, one for her own reference. She placed the table copy in the center, facing the investors, and she spoke from her own copy, which she did not need to look at but did, because it grounded her in the precision she required. She went through the figures in order. Household expenditure reduction, North Farm revenue recovery timeline, the blend settlement, which had been made in full, the wool merchant overage recovery, the coal merchant renegotiated rate, the social calendar confirmed for the full year, the projected estate income for 1818 compared to the previous 3 years, with the specific drivers of improvement named and documented. She spoke for 22 minutes without interruption, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not use a single word more than the information required. The room was quiet when she finished. One of the investors, a Mr. Forsyth, whom she had not previously encountered, said, "The North Farm recovery timeline. You project full revenue by the summer quarter. What is that projection based on?" She told him, specifically, citing the yield records, the new tenancy terms she had already negotiated with the replacement head tenant, and the county agricultural register's data on comparable farm recovery rates after tenancy changes. She cited a figure, a date, and a named document. Mr. Forsyth looked at the summary in front of him. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he is revising his understanding of. "This is 6 weeks' work," he said. It was not quite a question. 6 weeks and 3 days, Millicent said. The room did not erupt. There was a long, suspended moment, the particular kind that precedes a room changing its structure, and then Lord Aldrich Cavendish said, in a voice that had something reluctant and something precise in it, "The accounts are in order." It was not an apology. It was not an endorsement. It was accurate, and accuracy was all she had asked for. Tristan stood up. He had been seated at the head of the table and had not spoken during her presentation, which she had understood to be deliberate. He had let the work speak without the authority of his presence attached to it. He stood now, and the room attended to the shift. "The estate is managed by the Duchess," he said. "Any question regarding the Thornvale accounts or operations should be directed to her." He paused. "She is not an adjunct to my management. She is its principal instrument." He looked once at Lord Aldrich and then at the room. "I'd like that to be recorded in the meeting notes." The secretary wrote it down. Across the table, Viscount Westmore looked at his summary sheet and said nothing, which was the only thing he had to offer, and was, in its way, sufficient. Lady Charlotte Westmore's expectation had not made it to this room, which was its own kind of conclusion. She was not destroyed by it. She was simply made irrelevant by what the room now knew. Millicent gathered her papers. Tristan held her chair, which he did not need to do and had done anyway, with the specific deliberateness of a man who had made a decision before he entered the room. She had managed the Alderley accounts for 7 years before anyone called it management. She could manage being seen. That evening, in the library, after the journey back from Derby and the quiet dinner they ate without the performance of sociality because neither of them required it any longer, Tristan sat across from her in the chair that had become, over the past 6 weeks, his characteristic position during their evening work sessions, and he said, without preamble, "I told the room what you were." "I heard," she said. "I should have told them at the beginning of the meeting," he said, "before you stood up. I didn't, because I wanted them to hear the work first and understand the statement afterward." He paused. "I don't know if that was the right decision." "It was the right decision," she said. She looked at him directly. "They couldn't have heard the statement properly if they'd made up their minds about me before the work. You understood that." She paused. "You've understood that since October." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding something. "This is not a transaction," he said. "I told you it was, in October, and I was wrong." He stopped, and the pause was not evasion but the particular steadiness of a man saying something he has thought about for a long time. "Not because the terms changed, because I was looking for a quality I had not seen anywhere else, and I found it, and then I told myself it was a practical matter, and I was wrong about that too." He looked at her. "I know the difference now between a practical arrangement and the thing I am actually asking." She was still. "I am asking," he said, "if you would consider this a marriage in the full sense. Not because it is convenient or appropriate or because it fits the requirements my position imposes, but because the estate is more alive than it has been in 14 years, and I have spent every evening in the past 2 months not wanting to be anywhere else, and because you played my mother's composition through a closed door and waited to see if I was ready to hear it." Millicent looked at him for a long moment. She thought about it. She thought about it completely, the way she thought about every decision she made with her full attention, not from uncertainty, but from the requirement that her answer be the true one. "Yes," she said, "I think I have been considering it since Clause 12. He stood up and came around the table, and she rose to meet him, and he took her bare hand and held it in both of his for a moment without speaking. Then he raised it and kissed it, which was perhaps not entirely proper in a private library, and entirely proper between the two of them. "Your cravat is straight," she said. "I had it tied twice this morning," he said, "in case you were going to mention it." She laughed, a real one, which was not something she had done in front of another person for quite some time, and the sound of it surprised both of them, and then surprised neither of them. They were married in every sense by spring. The life they built was specific. In March, Millicent's reorganization of the North Farm's tenancy structure was complete, and the first quarter's yield figures came in at £580, not yet the full $620 she had projected, but within 12% of it, which Cartwright noted in his quarterly summary, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been waiting to say something complimentary and has finally found the right occasion. She noted his summary back with a penciled correction on one figure and returned it. In April, Sir Edward Lyme sent the previous Duchess's correspondence files. They arrived in 4 boxes, which Millicent spent 2 evenings sorting and cataloging. She found, inside the second box, a set of handwritten estate management notes, household systems, staff management philosophy, the kind of institutional knowledge that lives in a person and dies when they do, unless it is written down. She read them carefully. Some of what they described she had independently developed. Some was new to her. She began, quietly, to compile them with her own documentation into a single reference document, the sort of thing that could be used by a future steward, or, if circumstances ever required it, by someone who needed to understand how to run an estate like this from scratch. In June, the annual social calendar proceeded without a single collision, and Thornvale's summer dinner was the best organized it had been in a decade, according to Sir Edward, who attended and ate well and said so. In October, Lord Aldrich Cavendish came to Thornvale unannounced on a Tuesday, which Millicent had not expected, and which Tristan received in the study, with the bearing of a man prepared for the conversation either way. Lord Aldrich was shown into the study, and then, because Millicent was crossing the hall with the October accounts at the time, he stopped her, with a correctness that had not been in his manner in January. "I have reviewed the quarterly summary," he said. He meant the estate's quarterly investor summary, which Millicent had written and Tristan had signed. "It is thorough." "Thank you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the accounts under her arm. "I should have looked more carefully," he said, "in January, at what the work was." He did not elaborate. He did not apologize. He inclined his head briefly with the imperfect but genuine acknowledgement of a man who has revised an error he cannot entirely admit to. It was enough. It was more than she had expected, and she had not expected nothing. "You may look as carefully as you like," she said, "at any time. The accounts are open." She continued down the hall with the October accounts under her arm, and she did not look back. By the following spring, 3 neighboring estates had sent their stewards to Cartwright with requests to understand how the Thornvale quarterly reconciliation system worked. Millicent wrote the explanation herself, 12 pages, organized in the same way her father had taught her to organize information. The underlying principle first, then the specific method, then the practical application, then the figures. She sent it to each estate with a covering note. She kept copies. She had her father's letter framed, finally, the spring after that, and hung it in the estate office beside the window where the light was good. A small thing. She had kept it long enough as paper in a box under a bed. It deserved better than that. Their son was born in December 1819, 2 years after the contract was signed. They named him Edmund Aldrich Cavendish, Edmund for her father, the man who had taught her to see patterns, Aldrich, because Tristan had asked, and because the name was part of what he was made of, and she did not believe in erasing what a person is made of. Edmund came into the world loud and opinionated, and with his father's precise dark eyes, and his mother's facility for fixing her attention on whatever was in front of her, and refusing to look away until she had understood it. He learned to walk in the corridors of Thornvale House at 13 months, which was early, and he used this accomplishment to escape his nursemaid with a consistency that delighted his parents and confounded the staff. On a morning in the spring of 1820, when Edmund was 4 months past walking and had achieved, via a route no one had fully traced, the library, where he was discovered under the reading table with 3 ledger pages he had pulled from the lowest shelf, Millicent sat at the library table with the county land records and the previous quarter's accounts, and the reference document she had been compiling for 2 years, which had grown to 47 pages, and which Harriet Blaine had once picked up and read the first 8 pages of, before putting it down and saying, with complete sincerity, "You should have this copied and sent to every steward in the county." She had, in fact, been corresponding with a Derby printer about that exact possibility. Tristan came in from the estate in the late morning, having been with Cartwright and the new North Farm head tenant, and he was learning to read the room before he entered fully, a development she had noticed over the past 2 years without remarking on it, because some developments deserve to be simply observed. He came through the library door, saw Edmund under the table, and crouched down to retrieve him, which Edmund resisted with the full conviction of a child who considers his current arrangement entirely acceptable. Millicent looked up from her accounts. She watched Tristan lift their son from the floor, Edmund complaining in the direct, confident manner he had inherited from both parents and distributed equally across every occasion. His cravat was straight. He had been tying it straight for 2 years. She returned to her accounts. The spring figures were good. The summer would be better. Edmund settled against his father's shoulder and looked around the library with the expression of a person cataloging the available options, which was precisely the expression he had been born with, and which Millicent recognized without difficulty. Tristan looked at her over Edmund's head, a look she had learned to read over 2 years of evening work sessions and library fires, and music played through closed doors until the doors were opened. It was not a performance. It was the specific attention of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and has the sense not to look away. She knew he was watching. She picked up her pen and returned to the figures, and she was exactly where she had always been, at the edge of something vast and significant, doing the work, except that now the room was hers, and the ledger was hers, and the morning was hers, and so was the man watching her from across it, holding their child, waiting without impatience for her to finish her thought. She finished it. She put down her pen. The life was there on every page of the accounts, building forward, one correct entry at a time, everything she had ever been made of finally put to full use.